In the scorching heat of the Sonoran Desert, where the sun beats down mercilessly on the cracked earth and the horizon shimmers like a mirage, Sarah Martinez thought she had seen everything during her 15 years as a wildlife photographer. The red rocks of Arizona had become her second home, and she knew every trail, every watering hole, every hidden canyon where the desert creatures sought refuge from the brutal summer heat. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would discover on that fateful September morning when she decided to follow a single javelina deeper into the wilderness than any modern person had ventured in over a century. Sarah had been tracking a family of javelinas for 3 days, hoping to capture intimate photographs of their social behavior for National Geographic. These pig-like creatures, native to the American Southwest, were notoriously elusive, but Sarah had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict their movements. She had studied their patterns, learned their language of grunts and squeals, and could read the subtle signs they left in the desert sand like an ancient tracker. Her camera equipment was state-of-the-art. Her boots were worn from countless miles across the unforgiving terrain, and her water bottles were always full. She was the epitome of preparedness in one of the most dangerous environments in North America. The morning started like any other. Sarah had risen before dawn at her campsite near Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, the air still cool and filled with the haunting calls of coyotes in the distance. She checked her GPS, loaded her camera with fresh batteries, and set out on what she expected to be a routine day of wildlife photography. The javelina family had been feeding near a small wash about 2 miles from her camp, and she anticipated getting some excellent shots as they foraged for prickly pear cactus pads in the early morning light. But as Sarah approached the wash, something was different. The family group that had been together for days had scattered, leaving only a single adult female javelina standing alert near a cluster of barrel cacti. The animal's behavior was unusual. Instead of the typical foraging pattern, she seemed to be waiting, almost as if she was looking for something or someone. Sarah raised her camera and began taking shots, but the javelina remained motionless, her dark eyes fixed on a point in the distance that Sarah couldn't identify. Then, without warning, the javelina began to move. But this wasn't the slow, methodical progression that Sarah had observed countless times before. This animal was moving with purpose, with an urgency that seemed almost human in its intensity. She trotted steadily toward the south, away from the established animal trails, away from known water sources, away from everything that made sense in terms of javelina behavior. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before shouldering her equipment and following. The pursuit began innocently enough. Sarah maintained her distance, using her telephoto lens to keep the javelina in sight while staying far enough back to avoid disturbing the animal's natural behavior. But as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, Sarah realized this was unlike any animal tracking she had ever done. The javelina never paused to feed, never sought shade, never showed any of the typical behaviors of an animal in the desert heat. She simply continued south, moving with the determination of someone following a map. By midday, when the temperature had soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Sarah was beginning to question her decision to follow. They had traveled nearly 8 miles from the wash, crossing terrain that became increasingly rough and remote. The familiar landmarks of the national monument had long since disappeared behind them, and Sarah found herself in a part of the Sonoran Desert she had never explored. The landscape here was different, older somehow, with rock formations that seemed to predate the geological features she knew, and in silence that felt heavier, more profound than the typical desert quiet. But the javelina pressed on, and something deep in Sarah's photographer's instincts told her that this was leading to something extraordinary. She had spent her career documenting the natural world, and she had learned to trust those moments when nature revealed something unexpected, something that defied conventional understanding. So she continued to follow, her water supply dwindling, her skin burning despite her protective clothing, her GPS showing nothing but empty desert for miles in every direction. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the landscape that made her increasingly uneasy. The desert plants seemed different here, not different species, but somehow older, more gnarled, as if they had been shaped by forces beyond the typical wind and weather patterns of the region. The very air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand on end. And still the javelina continued south, never faltering, never showing signs of fatigue or confusion. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Sarah first saw the dust cloud on the horizon. At first, she dismissed it as a dust devil, one of the small whirlwinds that frequently formed in the desert heat. But as she watched through her camera lens, she realized the dust was too consistent, too purposeful to be natural weather phenomenon. The cloud was rising in a steady column, and it was directly in the path that the javelina was taking. Sarah's heart began to race as possibilities flooded through her mind. Had she unknowingly wandered onto private property? Was there some kind of construction or mining operation out here that wasn't on any of her maps? The idea of encountering other people in this remote location was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because she was running dangerously low on water, terrifying because she had no idea what kind of people would be operating in such an isolated area. The javelina seemed to sense the dust cloud as well, but instead of showing alarm or changing direction, she actually picked up her pace. Sarah struggled to keep up, her photographer's equipment feeling heavier with each step, her boots sliding on the loose rocks and sand. The dust cloud grew larger and more defined as they approached, and Sarah could begin to make out shapes within the swirling brown haze. What she saw defied every assumption she had made about what they might encounter. Rising from the desert floor like a vision from another century were the distinctive silhouettes of traditional Apache shelters, wickiups made of bent wooden frames covered with brush and animal hides. But these weren't the reconstructed historical displays she had seen in museums or tourist attractions. These structures looked lived in, authentic, as if they had been built yesterday by people who had never heard of the modern world. Sarah crouched behind a large boulder, her camera ready but her mind reeling with questions. The Apache had been removed from this part of Arizona over 100 years ago, relocated to reservations far from their ancestral homeland. There were no known Apache communities in this area, no legal settlements or recognized tribal lands. Yet here, in one of the most remote and inhospitable parts of the Sonoran Desert, was what appeared to be a functioning Apache camp. The javelina had stopped at the edge of the camp, no longer moving with the urgency that had driven her for hours. Instead, she stood calmly, almost as if she had arrived at her intended destination. Sarah watched in amazement as several figures emerged from the wickiups, men and women dressed in traditional Apache clothing, their movements deliberate and unhurried despite the presence of what should have been a wild animal in their midst. But what happened next challenged everything Sarah thought she knew about wildlife behavior and human-animal relationships. Instead of shooing the javelina away or showing any alarm at her presence, one of the Apache women approached the animal with obvious familiarity. She spoke to the javelina in what Sarah assumed was the Apache language, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air despite the distance. And incredibly, impossibly, the javelina seemed to be listening. Sarah's finger was poised over the camera shutter, ready to document what might be one of the most extraordinary wildlife interactions ever captured on film. But something held her back, a sense that she was witnessing something sacred, something that wasn't meant for outside eyes. The interaction between the woman and the javelina had an intimacy that spoke of a relationship far deeper than simple human-animal coexistence. The Apache woman knelt beside the javelina and placed her hand on the animal's head, speaking in low, rhythmic tones that seemed to match the cadence of traditional Apache chanting. Other members of the community had gathered around them, forming a circle that included the animal as naturally as if she were another member of their group. Sarah had never seen anything like it in all her years of wildlife photography, the complete absence of the barrier that typically existed between humans and wild animals. As Sarah watched, transfixed, she began to notice other details about the camp that deepened the mystery. The Apache people were dressed in traditional clothing that looked authentic down to the smallest detail, hand-woven textiles, silver jewelry that bore the distinctive stamp of traditional Apache craftsmanship, moccasins that showed the wear patterns of daily use rather than ceremonial display. Their faces showed the weathering of people who lived entirely outdoors, and their movements had the economy and grace that came from a lifetime of survival in harsh conditions. But perhaps most puzzling of all was the complete absence of any modern technology. Sarah could see no vehicles, no solar panels, no plastic containers or metal tools of contemporary manufacture. Even the most traditional Native American communities she had visited maintained some connection to the modern world, but this camp appeared to exist in complete isolation from the 21st century. It was as if she had somehow stumbled through a crack in time and found a community that had been living unchanged for generations. The javelina finally moved away from the woman and began to wander through the camp with the casual familiarity of a domestic animal. Children emerged from the wickiups and greeted her with obvious affection, scratching behind her ears and offering her bits of food. The sight was so incongruous that Sarah wondered if she was hallucinating from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Javelinas were not domesticated animals. They were wild creatures with sharp tusks and unpredictable temperaments, not the kind of animal that children would safely play with. But as Sarah continued to observe, she realized that the relationship between the Apache community and the javelina was just one aspect of a larger mystery. The people moved through their daily activities with a rhythm and purpose that spoke of a deep connection to the land and to each other. Women tended fires using traditional methods, men worked on what appeared to be hunting equipment, and children played games that seemed to have been passed down through generations unchanged. Sarah found herself facing an impossible decision. Every instinct as a photographer urged her to document what she was seeing. This could be one of the most significant anthropological discoveries of the century. But another part of her, the part that had learned to respect the natural world through years of patient observation, hesitated to intrude on what was clearly a private and sacred way of life. As she wrestled with this dilemma, Sarah became aware that the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon. She had been so absorbed in watching the Apache camp that she had lost track of time, and the reality of her situation began to dawn on her with growing urgency. She was at least 8 miles from her original campsite, in terrain she didn't recognize, with less than half a bottle of water remaining. The temperature would drop rapidly once the sun set, but without proper shelter or additional water, she would be in serious danger of exposure and dehydration. The logical course of action would be to approach the camp and ask for help. The Apache were renowned for their hospitality, and surely they would provide water and assistance to someone in distress. But Sarah hesitated, sensing that her presence might somehow disrupt the delicate balance of what she was witnessing. This community had clearly chosen isolation for reasons she couldn't understand, and the arrival of an outsider with modern equipment and no understanding of their customs might be unwelcome or even harmful. As Sarah debated her options, she noticed that several members of the Apache community were looking in her direction. At first she thought her hiding place behind the boulder was sufficient concealment, but gradually she realized that they were aware of her presence and had probably been aware of it since she first arrived. The thought sent a chill through her despite the lingering desert heat. These were people whose ancestors had survived for centuries in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, and their ability to detect intruders would be far beyond that of most modern people. One of the Apache men began walking in her direction, his movement unhurried but purposeful. Sarah's heart pounded as she considered her options. She could try to flee back into the desert, but she knew she would never make it to safety in her weakened condition. She could remain hidden and hope he would pass by, but it was clear he knew exactly where she was. Or she could reveal herself and hope that their traditional hospitality would extend to an uninvited observer. The man stopped about 20 feet from Sarah's hiding place and spoke in English, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. His accent was distinctly Apache, with the rhythmic cadence that Sarah had heard in recordings of traditional speakers, but his English was perfect and unaccented by any modern regional influences. "You have followed our guide for many miles," he said, gesturing toward the javelina who was still wandering peacefully through the camp. "She does not lead people to us without reason." Sarah emerged from behind the boulder, her camera equipment feeling suddenly heavy and inappropriate in this context. The Apache man was tall and lean, with the weathered features of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. His clothing was traditional but practical, buckskin shirt and leggings, moccasins that looked handmade, and a headband that held back long black hair streaked with silver. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They held a depth of knowledge and understanding that seemed to encompass far more than any individual lifetime could contain. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from hours in the dry desert air. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was following the javelina for my photography work, and I got lost. She gestured toward her camera equipment, suddenly aware of how foreign and technological it must appear to someone living in such traditional circumstances. The Apache man studied her for a long moment, his expression neither hostile nor welcoming but simply evaluative. "You are not lost," he said finally. "You are exactly where you were meant to be, at exactly the time you were meant to be here. The question is whether you are ready to understand why." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine despite the heat. There was something in the man's tone that suggested he knew more about her presence here than she did herself. "I don't understand," she said. "I was just following an animal that was behaving strangely. I'm a wildlife photographer. This is what I do for a living. And what you do for a living has brought you to a place where the old ways still survive," the man replied. "Your javelina friend is more than just an animal you have been following. She is a messenger, a bridge between the world you know and the world that existed here long before your people came to this land." As if responding to his words, the javelina appeared at the man's side, looking up at Sarah with intelligent eyes that seemed far too knowing for a wild animal. Sarah had photographed thousands of animals over the years, and she had developed an intuitive sense of their individual personalities and behaviors. But this javelina was different. There was something almost human in her expression, a consciousness that went beyond simple animal instinct. The Apache man placed his hand on the javelina's head with the same gentle familiarity that Sarah had observed earlier with the woman. "Her name is Shimisani," he said. "It means my grandmother in our language. She has been with our people for longer than you would believe possible, and she has never brought an outsider to our camp before." Sarah's scientific mind struggled to process what she was hearing. Javelinas had a lifespan of 7 to 8 years in the wild, perhaps slightly longer in captivity. The idea that this animal could have been with the Apache community for an extended period was biologically impossible. But as she looked into Shimisani's eyes, Sarah found herself questioning many of the assumptions she had built her career upon. "I don't understand any of this," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This camp, your people, this animal, none of it makes sense according to everything I know about history and biology and the modern world." The Apache man smiled for the first time since their conversation began, and Sarah was struck by how the expression transformed his weathered features. "The modern world," he said, "is a very recent invention. It has existed for perhaps 200 years out of the thousands and thousands of years that people have lived on this land. What you call impossible, we call the way things have always been." He gestured toward the camp, where the daily activities continued with the same peaceful rhythm Sarah had observed earlier. "My people never left this land," he said. "When the soldiers came to move us to the reservations, some of us went, as was necessary for the survival of our children and grandchildren. But others stayed, hidden in the deep places of the desert, keeping the old ways alive until the time came when they would be needed again." Sarah looked around at the landscape that surrounded them, trying to understand how an entire community could have remained hidden in one of the most surveyed and mapped regions of the United States. "But how is that possible?" she asked. "There are satellite images, government surveys, park rangers who patrol these areas regularly. How could you have remained undetected for over a century?" The Apache man's expression grew more serious, and he looked toward the western horizon where the sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky. "There are places in this desert that do not appear on your maps," he said. "Sacred places that have been protected by powers older than your government, older than your satellites, older than your understanding of what is possible in this world." As if to emphasize his words, Sarah suddenly became aware that the landscape around them looked different than it had when she first arrived. The rock formations seemed more varied, the plant life more diverse, and the very quality of the light had a richness that she had never seen in her years of desert photography. It was as if the camp existed in a pocket of space that followed different rules than the surrounding desert. "This is impossible," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to the Apache man. "I must be hallucinating from dehydration. None of this can be real." "Reality," the man said gently, "is far more complex than your modern world has taught you to believe. You have spent your life documenting the natural world, but you have only seen the surface of what exists." Shimasani has brought you here to see deeper, to understand that the connection between all living things is not just a poetic metaphor but a literal truth. As if responding to her name, the javelina moved closer to Sarah, nuzzling against her leg with the affection of a longtime companion. Sarah reached down instinctively to stroke the animal's coarse fur, and the moment her hand made contact, she felt a jolt of energy that seemed to flow through her entire body. Suddenly, the exhaustion and dehydration that had been building throughout the day seemed to fade, replaced by a clarity of perception that made everything around her appear more vivid and alive. Through this enhanced awareness, Sarah began to see details about the Apache camp that had escaped her notice before. The wickiups weren't just traditional shelters. They were arranged in a pattern that seemed to follow the natural energy lines of the landscape. The people weren't just going about daily activities. They were participating in a complex dance of interaction with the land itself, reading signs and responding to subtle changes in the environment that were invisible to modern senses. And Shimasani wasn't just a javelina. She was something far more significant, a being that served as a living connection between the human and animal worlds, between the past and present, between the visible and invisible aspects of the desert ecosystem. Sarah realized that her presence here wasn't a random accident of wildlife tracking but the result of a carefully orchestrated series of events that had been designed to bring her to this moment of understanding. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with awe and confusion. "Why has Shimasani brought me here? What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" The Apache man looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of generations. "That," he said, "is a question only you can answer. But I will tell you this, you have been chosen to witness something that few outsiders have ever seen, and with that witnessing comes responsibility. The old ways are not just historical curiosities to be preserved in museums. They are living wisdom that may be crucial for the survival of all life on this earth." As the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and gold, Sarah realized that her life had been fundamentally changed by this encounter. She had come into the desert as a wildlife photographer seeking to document animal behavior, but she was leaving with knowledge that challenged everything she thought she understood about the relationship between humans and the natural world. The Apache man extended his hand toward her, and Sarah realized he was offering her a choice. She could return to her familiar world of scientific observation and rational explanation, treating this encounter as an unexplainable anomaly to be filed away and forgotten. Or she could accept the deeper truth that Shimasani and the Apache community represented, and find a way to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. As Sarah reached out to take the man's hand, she knew that whatever choice she made would determine not just her own future, but possibly the future of the delicate balance between human civilization and the natural world that had sustained all life for countless generations. The javelina looked up at her with those knowing eyes, and Sarah understood that she was being offered the chance to become something more than just an observer of nature. She was being invited to become a participant in its deepest mysteries. The story of what happened next would depend on whether Sarah Martinez had the courage to step fully into a world where the impossible was not only possible, but necessary for the survival of everything she had spent her life trying to understand and protect. In the growing twilight of the Arizona desert, surrounded by people who had kept ancient secrets alive for over a century, Sarah faced the most important decision of her life, guided by a javelina who was far more than she appeared to be.